I'm going to be have the pleasure of moderating the discussion today, which was really organized at the initiative of the British Uzbek Society, and we thank them for having the idea to host this webinar. We have 5 excellent speakers. I'm going to briefly run through the process for the meeting and the agenda, and then we will begin with welcoming comments from Ambassador Rustamov, who has kindly taken time out of his busy schedule to join us. So hopefully by now you are all familiar with Zoom and these webinars. They have become the new normal, but it's an exciting way for us to join together with speakers from London, from Brussels, and from Tashkent. We will be running this meeting with a series of presentations on the economic situation in Uzbekistan and the impact of COVID-19. We will then run a question and answer session, which will give you an opportunity to have your questions answered by the participants. You will see at the bottom of your screen a Q&A section. You can ask your questions, and then if you see questions that you would like to be answered by the participants, you can click the small thumbs and vote for those questions as being ones that you consider important to be addressed, and that's one way for me to know which questions we should prioritize. So during the course of the presentations, if there's something you'd like to know more about, please do submit your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom. In addition, after the presentations, we will be running a short interactive poll. And that's a way for us to have get some insight from how you all see the situation in Uzbekistan and what you see as the outlook. And then we'll ask the speakers to respond to that poll. So without further ado, I want to thank everyone for taking the time to participate. I'm really pleased to say we have over 100 attendees watching the webinar at the moment. And so I will turn it over to Ambassador Rustamov to issue some welcoming comments. Please, Ambassador.
Thank you, Isfandiar. Thank you. Good morning to all participants. Thank you for the invitation for today's event. I would like to express my appreciation to organizer, first of all, British Uzbek Society, Europe-Uzbekistan Association for Economic Cooperation, Center for Economic Research, and reforms under the administration of the President of Uzbekistan. Of course, here to you, your investor. I also would like to thank all participants who are joining. So the number I see on the screen, that the number is raising, who joined this virtual roundtable conference to hear how Uzbekistan deal with COVID-19 pandemics. As my colleagues from the Center for Economic Research and Reform, Mr. Umid Khajayev and other speakers probably they provide more detailed information, let me just briefly highlight Uzbekistan's perception of COVID-19 challenge and approach to deal with it. As everywhere, COVID-19 had a negative impact to national economy and society of Uzbekistan, in effect, microeconomics, as well as the well-being of people. And to mitigate, this negative impact of the pandemic, the government of Uzbekistan took comprehensive anti-crisis measures, and we actually encountered a kind of the dilemma, the health of our citizens or maintaining economic activity. And we tried to find out the more reasonable and balanced approach. For example, to save lives of people and prevent spread of COVID-19 among population, a strict quarantine regime has been introduced in the country. But at the same time, the government had fully committed itself to social support and providing citizens with essential food, medicine, and other necessary goods. To save economy, the broad measures also were implemented, including the creation of $1 billion worth anti-crisis fund and active and targeted measures to keep, active key sectors of national economy. And today we already have some practical results. The 34 million people strong Uzbekistan, the proportion of cases with the coronavirus and especially the proportion of death cases are very low. We still have, and there are projections that we will have a positive GDP growth this year around probably 1.5%, but also we are expecting the sharp jump from 5.5 to 7% in next year. It's according to estimates of some financial institutions like ADB, EBRD, IMF, and World Bank. Of course, it's not time for complacency. We fully understand that quarantine regime will not be fully lifted within 1 or probably 1.5 years. So depending on the dynamics of the situation, the quarantine may be strengthened. It means adaptation, this kind of adaptation to new realities and finding the new, let's say, opportunities for cooperation, for doing business, and for all other such kind of things. And here I would like to say that there are big opportunities. I think there are big opportunities for strengthening multifaceted Uzbek-UK cooperation. Both sides expressed in let's say, interest and intention to do it. During just recent 1 month, we had a high-level online negotiation between the foreign ministries, between the Ministry of Investment and Foreign Trade of Uzbekistan and DIT from British side, as well as of other institutions. Recently, we had several rounds of webinars between doctors of both countries to share experience how to deal with COVID-19. So we are working to organize the meeting of Uzbek-British Trade and Industry Council in next February. And the embassy also do quite active work to facilitate the direct negotiations between businesses, between entrepreneurs of both countries. So the process is going on. And in general, I think as we face some challenges over COVID-19, we also have opportunities which we can use successfully. Probably I will stop here, and once again I welcome all participants, and I will myself on this opportunity to wish all of you be safe and in good spirits these challenging times. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, for the introduction. And I think you raised a really important point that hopefully we'll discuss here, which is to what extent the relatively swift action that the Uzbek government took will change certainly the outlook from a public health standpoint, but also from an economic standpoint. I mean, it's been interesting for me to see the sort of difference in approach between Uzbekistan and some of the other countries in the region and in generally West Asia, which may end up being to the credit of the government. So without further ado, we're going to now turn to a more detailed discussion of the economic impact from Omid Abidhajayev. And I'm going to share a presentation that has been prepared to basically share some of the data that is being captured about the current economic impact. Omid, please, hopefully you see your presentation. Is that right?
Yep. Can we go to the next slide, please?
Excellent. There we are.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting, dear friends. I would like to thank all participants, organizers, and really glad and surprised that so many people find time, will, and energy to join webinars, especially these days during COVID era. Briefly, I would like to explain how Uzbekistan is coping with COVID economy-wise, give some preliminary results of our diagnostics, and explain how government tackled and continue to tackle this issue. From organizational point, the next day when the first patient was identified, it was in mid-March in Uzbekistan, a special task force was organized or created. So officially, it's called the Republican Commission. It's chaired by Prime Minister. And gradual, but as Standard mentioned, effective and very fast immediate measures were taken in terms of lockdown, practicing social distances, elimination of non-essential movement. And at the same week, our center, we also started calculating a CU model. So we followed publication by Imperial College of London, and it was also used by Future of Humanity Institute at the University of Oxford. We can calibrate the model based on age, structure of population, duration of treatment, number of infection rate, which stands as proxy for transmission. So first, when we looked at this, our scenarios based on the model looked quite pessimistic, I would say even scary. So the reduction of transmission or reproduction rate was of ultimate importance. So corresponding measures on massive sanitizing, practicing social distance. I mean, what was done in Europe and all over the world, we also started doing this, but in a massive and a very fast scale. As a result, this measure saved so many lives. I mean, look at the number of recovered patients, 2,600, a bit more. It's around 80% of form infected. This is pretty good results when in the world it's equal to around 40%. Number of people who unfortunately passed away due to virus is equal to 14. It's 1/4. But as expected, this caused some negative impact on the economy. The economy growth is expected to slow down, similar to industrial, I mean, all its value-added export and import, as you might observe with the results of first quarter. To cope with this, we need diagnostics again, because if you look at economic output, you can calculate it on a quarterly base, but we need something of a shorter range. So we employed both quantitative and qualitative approach, which is mostly directed towards the domestic economy. For qualitative part, we developed the monthly barometers thanks to Berlin Economics, following IFO Institute methodology. So you can see business climate index and consumer sentiment index. We can observe that when we asked about 6,000 people and look at the response rate, negative answers were more positive when it comes to income or purchases of durable goods. Even so, people perceive the lockdown measures positively because they understand that this is necessary to save lives, but this is how it's affecting consumption. If you look at quantitative data, the results going down, but if you look at sentiment, as you can see, the 34% answered positively, 19% answered negatively. The rest is kind of neutral. They're thinking, okay, it will continue, the business continue as usual. It's about how companies feel, and if you look at what they're doing now, the quarantine and the lockdown is relaxed a bit currently, so economy slowly finds itself on the faster recovery, so I'm slowing down. And companies are resuming their activity, as observed by some proxy indicators. For example, 91% of companies in industry, 76% in construction, 52% in services, and 44% in trade resumed their activities. In May, we observed that 15% increase in the amount of loans given by commercial banks compared to last month, and the sale of construction materials increased by 20%. How this was possible? So, of course, it's related with exit strategy included into conditional mitigation of lockdown. Measure change is in terms of coverage of lockdown, because at the beginning it was at the Republican level, and now we're looking at the district level. So by district, I mean second order administrative division. After the Republic comes regions, and after the regions are districts. Okay, depending on degree of infection, districts are categorized to red, yellow, and green. Probably here we can go to the next slide. So you can see this red, yellow, and green, depending on how a region is free from infection. So currently around the 36 districts out of 200 plus is in red, and 6 regions are pronounced free from coronavirus. So this might demonstrate to some extent the effectiveness of measures so far. And first of all, we need to admit that this was due to fast and immediate measures taken by the government. This bought us time. Most important thing is that it bought us time to equip the medical staff in hospitals, or what usually people say to flatten the curve. And then creation of anti-crisis funds with amount of $1 billion, which were directed towards the 3 major aims. The first, of course, we need to, as I said, equip medical staff to fight the virus, including bonuses to their salaries. And secondly, provide support to people who need social care, help businesses to maintain their activity. And of course, we need to bring people back. So far, 47,000 people were brought back to Uzbekistan. In total, if you look from a regulatory standpoint, there were 16 resolutions directed to cope with COVID, with more than 40 measures on exemption of or delays related to tax payment. So usually how you can help with the tax payment, it's either delay or deferral. All of this were directed to ensure that this balance of the economy and all interactions, which you can see in the slide, this is the slide, experiences minimum damage. So conditionally, all of these resolutions can be divided into four groups, four categories. The first one directed to cope with COVID pandemic. Second is to have business with relaxation of fiscal measures. For example, some companies they can pay VAT on a quarterly basis now. Business entities are exempted from paying land tax and property tax, etc. Third package was more about balancing the budget and readjusting public investment. And third package is about exit strategy. So there's particular focus on speeding up infrastructure projects, and because of the pandemic, so many people left without jobs, we need to consider all sectors which are more labor intensive. So mainly this, and all of this are summarized in our joint work with the Development Strategy Center, which is uploaded and disseminated also in English language and with all the details. Also, I need to mention this phenomenon of support and helping in Uzbekistan. It's kind of form of, we can say, a corporate social responsibility. So along with government, business started helping people with food and primary necessities from the day one. But later, government announced nationwide movement for prosperity and charity. The main idea was, for example, in return to such acts of corporate social responsibility, the business might get some tax deductions, access to finance, and enjoy simplified process of customs procedures. I hope this will turn into some, let's say, a permanent legislation, like developed legislation, which rewards, which kind of acknowledges those who serve others in difficult times. And finally, I mentioned that at the center we have some instruments for forecasting of epidemics. We have developed these barometers to understand the sentiment of households and business. Along that, also we also monitor quantitative data on weekly basis. It's tax revenues, exports, turnover, commodity exchange, etc. But we do not have an instrument which could capture sentiment of foreign business interested or somehow connected with Uzbekistan or Central Asia. And we believe that such instrument might be needed. And of course, this kind of webinars are useful, but if we can put it in a more systematic form, and we can come up with an indicator which on a monthly or quarterly basis, let's call it foreign business sentiment. That also might be useful. I think it would be useful in a mutual basis because the government can address then some of those issues on a timely and a constructive manner. At the very least, it will do is it communicate us, and we can hear what the foreign businesses are saying. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amit. That was very comprehensive. I mean, two things stuck out to me immediately. One is that I think you're describing this interesting cooperation between government, business, civil society, and the financial sector. And it's interesting that you raised that maybe now would be a good opportunity to look at actually formalizing some of these methods of cooperation that helped the country show some resiliency to the crisis. I also think the point you raised about foreign business sentiment is super important. I know that Louis later in the conversation will be touching on that. And of course, when we run this little poll at the end of the presentations, it will take an opportunity now to get responses from around 150 participants, and we can try and understand what the sentiments might be. So now we turn to Oybek Shaykhov, who is also going to talk a little bit from the perspective of someone who's working to build stronger economic ties between Uzbekistan and Europe. Oybek, your presentation is should be in front of you, and I turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Isfandyar. I suppose you can hear me fine now.
Yes.
So you can. I will jump directly to the first slide, and I will be presenting the economic impacts and the fire response, as well as some perspectives that we are going to see in the coming years and quarters. So when you talk about Q1, Uzbekistan actually recorded GDP growth of 4.1% in the first quarter of 2020. It is indeed smaller than 2019, but nonetheless 4.1% is a good growth. However, the Q1 data only partially reflects the impact of COVID-19 because, okay, first gradual quarantine was only introduced on 15th of March, and but already the country did feel the decline in China, and this you will see, of course, with a decline in the sale of natural resources, particularly natural gas and export of non-ferrous metals as well. Export, when you look at April, and this data was actually released only a few days ago by the Central Bank of Uzbekistan. I suppose we can provide a link to that document as a follow-up email to this webinar. I'm sure many people ask for slides. Export decreased 10%, import decreased 10.8%, so slightly larger. Foreign reserves of Uzbekistan, thanks to gold growth, have actually reached over 30 billion, but the quantity of gold did decrease. The gold substantially increased in terms of exports, so it increased by 26% in the first quarter, which made up 35% total exports in January to April. So this is the first quarter plus 1 month. That's, in my view, that actually shows a very good cash flow management strategy by the Ministry of Finance and Central Bank, which compensated for the decrease of exports in natural gas. You see the figures here. I don't have to read them, so just at the bottom you had some key sectors which did decline, but the gold sales went up quickly. And when you look at other data also published by the central bank, you can also see actually a lot of foreign reserves, cash reserves have been brought into the country very quickly to compensate this increased spending. Of course, the government has set up 1 billion fund sometime in the middle of March. As of end of March, already 100 million of that have been spent based on the Ministry of Finance data, and we can see that this is really, in my view, it is fantastic management in terms of cash flow by both central bank and the Ministry of Finance. So if you go to the next slide, and we will shortly talk about the IFI. So next slide, please. The IFI response, all of the IFIs, it's the one before. Yeah, this is the one. So if you can see the projections, so this is a summary of projections of all the IFIs, ADB, well, not all, but key IFIs which work with Uzbekistan. The Islamic Bank data is not here, but the key data, you can see at the bottom, Uzbek Central Bank guidance is actually a range. They don't give the data for 2021, but they give the data for 2020. And except ADB, which has released its projections for GDP growth a little bit earlier than the other ones, and therefore you can see it's a little bit of an outlier, I would say, and I do believe this data will be revised. Other IFIs are in line, more or less, that it's going to be between 1.5%, just over 1.5% growth. That has been revised substantially by all IFIs. The growth in Uzbekistan has been expected to be about 5.5%, around that area. But V-shaped recovery is also very clear, because you can see all the IFIs are consistent in terms of projecting very substantial growth in economic growth in Uzbekistan for 2021. When you look at the region, so this is the green side. When you look at the region, Uzbekistan is actually doing pretty well in the regional perspective, because, well, and Louis, I think, will talk about it a bit later, because Uzbekistan is indeed a very diversified economy. I have been speaking with the chief economist, regional economist of EBRD last week, and some of you have watched the webinar. It is available on the EUROUZ website and the mailing list. The chief regional economist of EBRD said Uzbekistan is a train that nothing can stop in terms of economic growth. So, of course, you can see consistency because of this diversified economy. You can see a little bit more consistency between the IFIs, and you look at the table on the right side compared to other countries in the region. And of course, when you look at Central Asia as a whole, Uzbekistan is indeed a star, mainly because of this diversified economy, lack of dependence on one natural resource mainly, which is being exported. So if you go to the next slide, please. When you talk about debt, of course, additional spending is a critical element for any country around the world in these times of crisis. And you see Uzbekistan, based on IMF report, Uzbekistan will need 4 billion, roughly 7% of GDP, to mitigate the economic shock. And you can see the government has already, in fact, reached a preliminary agreement with the IFIs. A big chunk of that requirement will be financed by the IFIs, and that's around 3 billion. A document has been published and signed by the president a few weeks ago, 22nd of, well, it's more than months ago. This is what happens when you are locked up in at home. So more than a month ago, you have a roadmap there, which I do recommend whoever is interested in Uzbekistan to look at, and I suggest we do send this document out as well. The reference is there, a clear roadmap of how Uzbekistan is planning to attract the financing from IFIs, which projects, where it's going to go which are going to be grants, which are going to be loans, and this is actually available, and I do recommend that this is a very important document. Fiscal deficit forecast is expected to increase indeed, and therefore I believe, at least at EUROUZ here, we believe that Uzbekistan may be looking at additional bond placements later in the year. There was a call with investors end of March with the Ministry of Finance. Most of us on the panel have been on that call. There have been no direct reference to say that we are going to do it, but the Ministry of Finance did say that they are going to track the market, and it's normal, of course, for the governments to finance fiscal deficit through bond placements. Uzbekistan, and Louis will talk about it later, is actually looking very good in terms of the debt. It did reach the external debt did increase substantially last year, but the country has put a cap on the debt, and if you match and mix the figures, you can actually see that 1 billion is exactly the amount which is still necessary, and somehow Uzbekistan will have to find that, and therefore educated guess would be that it's something, bonds would be something that the country will consider. So I'll stop here. I hope I didn't run out of too much out of my time, but the key message is indeed Uzbekistan is coping fairly quickly. Of course, there will be negative impact. Of course, there will be substantial challenges that the country will have to face. But overall, regionally, and even when you look at globally, in fact, because Uzbekistan started to actually come out and integrate its economy into the world economy quite late, that actually played towards an advantage in this time of an economic crisis to say, yes, we are a little bit better placed to deal with the crisis than some other countries which are indeed more integrated into the global supply chains. Thank you very much.
Oybek, thank you. That was, I think, very comprehensive. And I think the connection you drew between basically Uzbekistan's position in global trade and then the impact on balance of payments and the fiscal position of the government is an important one. We have a great question, I think, that will touch on some of those issues when we get to the Q&A. And just a reminder to everyone that if you do have questions, please do submit them through the Q&A feature. And we will take a set of round of questions after the final two presentations. But Eldor, maybe now we can turn to you. And we've heard a little bit about the macroeconomic picture, sort of the larger implications for, let's say, government budgets and spending, and the fact that Uzbekistan will have to find some additional financing. But I know that you wanted to draw attention to the impact on the business environment specifically in the country. So it would be excellent to have your take on that from Tashkent. So you should see your presentation in front of you now.
Thank you, Yar. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. In my presentation, I would like to focus on challenges faced by Uzbek companies as well as multinationals carrying out business in Uzbekistan, and more specifically in the context of implementing long-term infrastructure investment projects. I should note that COVID may have equally damaging impact on projects irrespective of their completion status. For example, we observe that some projects with 95% completion still face major hurdles. All equipment and materials may have been delivered to the site, but due to travel restrictions, foreign specialists like engineers cannot be on site to supervise installation works or commissioning. And as a result, local labor also finds itself on standby. Additionally, additional expenses arise due to standby of heavy equipment, special machinery, since often such equipment are procured on rental basis. Other challenges include liquidity shortage. I think Louis will talk about this, and Oybek mentioned, whether arising from inability to repay interest or principal amounts to even capital flow restrictions imposed in other countries. And what we see as one of key takeaways, that COVID is not like a local challenge. It's not just issue in Uzbekistan, but it's a global challenge which impacts Uzbek business as well as multinationals operating in Uzbekistan. Next slide, please. In the next slide, I would like to focus on one very important issue relating to employment, because it is another major challenge which COVID has posed in front of business community. Obviously, like in many other jurisdictions, Uzbek government has put in place requirements relating to safeguarding interests of employees. Hence, all employers had to quickly put in place measures relating to organizing remote working to the extent it is practical. This in turn exposed other practical issues relating to sourcing of equipment and logistics. For example, I think it's not a big secret, internet connection, especially in regions, is not really ideal. So employers had to consider various options like change of position of workers, move them to other responsibilities, switching from full-time to part-time work, as well as imposing a rotational system of work. We know that in major construction projects, rotational system is usual, but this has also been taken on by operating plants and factories. In other words, employers would arrange that a group of workers remain on site for 2 weeks, and then they will be rotated by another group following 2 weeks. So this way, they achieve continuous and, very importantly, safe job site activities. Next slide. Finally, next slide, please. Yeah. Okay. So finally, I would like to refer to some of mitigation measures. I think you jumped, yeah. Previous slide, yeah. This is the internet connection, you see. And on my final slide, I would like to refer to some of mitigation measures implemented in the current COVID environment and how businesses, whether local businesses or multinationals, are benefiting. Our colleagues from the center, they have listed these comprehensive measures, and I'm not going to repeat them all, and you can see some of them on the screen. These are fiscal and non-fiscal support measures like tax waiver or deferrals of loan repayments are also reflected on this slide. The only point, I guess, I would like to make in respect of such measures is government's rapid reaction to COVID situation. As you can see, within 2 months, from March 15 to May 15, over 20 various regulations have been passed to mitigate And we see even today that the government continues to actively monitor the situation in order to react as quickly as possible. And I think that's very, very important element of trying to overcome this situation. And of course, business, whether it is international business operating in Uzbekistan or local business, would highly appreciate. And the final point I would like to talk about is application of force majeure. In this context, government has acknowledged COVID as force majeure by resolution 5969, and to this effect, the Ministry of Investment, Foreign Trade, as well as Chamber of Commerce, are authorized to issue force majeure certificates. And we know that many multinationals have benefited from this opportunity and have received such certificates. However, usually in practice or in the past, force majeure would normally connect to a certain locality, earthquake or flooding in one location, and its influence would be in certain jurisdiction. Very few would have provided in contracts that global force majeure, because COVID is having impact globally, and it's not just an issue in Uzbekistan. And mitigation measures taken by jurisdictions are not necessarily uniform in these different countries. For example, in some countries, COVID has been declared as a state of emergency, while in other jurisdictions like Uzbekistan, it's been limited to quarantine measures. And of course, legal consequence of this also different from country to country. While everybody recognizes COVID as a force majeure, often contracts are silent on splitting of costs and what to do during force majeure, especially this type of force majeure. And today we see many questions like who should pay for standby of labor, equipment, as well as any additional costs relating to utilities during persistence of this situation. And in this context, extension of time for projects or investment may not necessarily be a sufficient remedy. And I guess I would complete my presentation with a question that this is like open question, which probably parties, government, business community will find solution in coming weeks or months. Thank you very much. I hope I stayed within time frame.
That was excellent, thank you. And we've gotten some very good questions in response to your presentation. So I think, you've laid out obviously the impact of this on some of the larger projects and the delays, and these are obviously global impacts. So now I guess we turn to Louis Steiner to basically try and give a perspective of, from your view, Louis, working on particularly UK-Uzbek relations and advising clients on their market entry and activities in the country. How is all of this going to impact the view of foreign investors towards the Uzbek economy? And in what ways does the Uzbek economy look similar or different to other frontier or emerging markets? Because as Omid mentioned earlier in the conversation, we really want to try and understand what's the sentiment of the investor community towards countries like Uzbekistan as we move into this new kind of global downturn.
Thank you, Yar. So if we go to my first slide, a number of things I'm going to say reiterate what's already been said by the previous speakers. On this slide, I've tried to summarize what is the economic impact of COVID globally. And I think it's best described as a self-enforcing cycle. You've got the supply shock, you've got a demand shock, and you've got a credit crunch that are interacting with one another. This has obviously had a negative impact on capital markets and the willingness to provide finance. So I think in the more developed economies where you have integrated supply chains, as has already been hinted, that there is going to be a real challenge dealing with both the downturn and building recovery. If we go to the next slide. For Uzbekistan, I think the first thing to note is that it's in an advantageous position because it's probably the late starter amongst its competitors or contemporaries. Obviously, the economy has opened up and investment has begun to flow in over the last 3 or 4 years. That the policies that have been pursued have been structured. There's been a lot of discipline in terms of finances, deficit, and there hasn't been the exposure to debt that you see in other emerging market economies. So I think the fact that Uzbekistan was sort of last of the countries in the region to develop has actually played in its favor here. Oybeks emphasized the diverse nature of the Uzbek economy, the fact that it's not dependent on any one product. I think we also need to note the fact that it's not just trading with 1 or 2 countries. It trades with Russia, Kazakhstan, China, Turkey. So there's a diversity in terms of export markets. Its economy is also not very sophisticated. As I said, it's not in the middle of complex supply value chains. There probably won't be a long-term impact on the demand for agricultural produce. You're seeing some impact, obviously, at the moment with trade with Kazakhstan. As Oybeks emphasized, the sale of gold's increased, so the impact on revenue from commodities is also not going to be damaged long-term. And this means that the export revenue will come back. And indeed, the IFIs has been emphasized, all predict not only that GDP won't contract this year, but that it will rebound next year quicker than in other emerging and frontier economies. The fact that the debt ceiling has been capped and that the government is working actively with the IFIs, I think, is very positive. The level of non-IFI debt is going to be relatively modest. And obviously, that's something that investors look at when they're analyzing country risk. If we go to the next slide. So what would be the impacts that would concern investors? I think one of the things that hasn't been mentioned, perhaps it's the elephant in the room, is remittances. Obviously, a considerable part of foreign currency earnings came from Uzbek workers living and working in Russia and other countries. They of course have collapsed in the first quarter, and in particularly in April. So you see a real decrease. I think the central bank is predicting that remittances will fall around 35% through to the end of the year, which is 5% of GDP. You also see some devaluation in the Uzbek sum. That was inevitable because obviously the national currencies of the trading partners were both declining. As Oybek emphasized, Uzbekistan is in a better position here because its currency isn't so tied to the price of crude oil. So whereas devaluation in Kazakhstan and Russia has been 15%, the devaluation so far in Uzbekistan has only been 6%. You see a fall in foreign trade turnover because of border closures, because of the lower commodity prices, reduced economic activity, which means that the current account deficit is increasing. Predictions are that it will be at around 9.4% by the end of the year. But the government is able to finance this deficit, both through its reserves, foreign currency reserves, and attracting external debt. So I think on the whole, although investors would look at these particular impacts, they would come to the conclusion that because of the healthy reserve that Uzbekistan has built up, and because of the policies it's been pursuing, particularly with the IFIs, that there will not be the types of risks they'll see elsewhere in terms of rapidly inflating debt. Final slide. So amongst our our clients. I mean, obviously, investors, they fall into different sort of groupings. I've been very simplistic on this slide and split it into foreign direct investment and portfolio investment, because we do work with strategic investors who are investing into projects, as Eldor has said, and we also work with funds who are investing across sectors by acquiring unlisted or listed shares in Uzbek companies. FDI, I think, if it does decline, which is quite possible, it's as much about the decline in the value of the strategic investors as it is about their perception of risk in Uzbekistan. I think a lot of our clients now are putting particularly capital capex intensive projects on hold because they want to understand where they are in 3-6 months. So this is less about Uzbekistan. It's more about the sorts of cash management investment policies being pursued by the larger companies. The same goes for banks. I think they are less likely to be willing to finance high-risk projects because obviously projected revenues have been reduced. There's a higher credit risk. We do a lot of work in the power space, non-conventional power space, both inside Uzbekistan and globally. There are some sectors, such as renewables, where perhaps this won't be so much the case, because a lot of projects in that sector are developed on the basis of long-term agreements where you have feed-in tariffs, so investors and lenders are confident that the project will have a consistent revenue. So I think the impact here will be different across sectors, where there is a revenue stream, where there are guaranteed offtake arrangements, guaranteed revenue sources, then perhaps projects will continue. Portfolio investors, funds, I mean, I think it's very much open still as to where they will focus, those that still have money. I think some of the larger institutional investors will, as I've just hinted, will go towards renewable energy. They'll go towards infrastructure, because clearly governments need to keep infrastructure working. They need to keep the power on. And with COVID emphasizing the opportunity to accelerate the energy transition, the green transition, if you believe a lot of the policy statements coming out of different European and non-European governments, this could be seen as an opportunity for people really to engage and push forward that. My own impression is a lot of them are now refocusing on developed markets. You've had a drop in share prices. I guess the drop in share prices nowhere near reflects the what's happening on the street, that there's still a real disjuncture there. But clearly they are identifying now opportunities on established exchanges. Whether or not that will mean that they refocus and Uzbekistan isn't a priority, that's to be seen. And indeed, whether or not some of the investors see the risks in investing in the established exchanges as equally high because of the amount of debt governments have taken on, and the fact that a lot of the prices you see are very much reflective of the support governments have provided. I think that's still very much open. So that's my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Louis. So, I mean, that rounds out the presentations, and we now have around half an hour for Q&A. Thank you for everyone who has submitted questions in the box below. There are some excellent questions that we will get to in a moment. But what I'm going to do now is, while we move into the Q&A, I'm going to launch a poll that I would like everyone on this call, and there are just around 150 participants on the call, so it's actually a pretty substantial poll, to respond to. They're just 3 questions, but it's an opportunity for us to gauge some sentiments on your part as individuals looking at this market and working in this market. And then we will ask the speakers to respond to the poll and see see if there was anything surprising about the results. So you should all hopefully see the poll now on your screen. Please go through and provide responses. I will let this run for around 5-10 minutes while we answer the first set of questions, and then we will be able to proceed to the basically look at the poll itself. Does everyone see the poll in front of them? Has that come through? There we are. Hopefully you can see the poll, and I can see the responses coming through. Okay, so in terms of questions, we have a few, I think, really key questions that touch on some of what's come up in the conversation so far. And I'm going to basically raise these questions together and ask for the panelists to respond. So the first question, which is also being addressed in the poll, is really about when things might return to normal. One of the panel audience has asked, what steps are being taken to protect infrastructure and transport links for Uzbekistan? And Oybek, your presentation highlighted the important role that Uzbekistan's exports are going to play in the V-shaped recovery that we are expecting. To what extent is Uzbekistan making sure that, given it's in a difficult position as a double landlocked country, that the goods it's exporting can continue to reach international markets? And related to that, Ambassador, perhaps you can comment on this, but there's also been a question about when will travel from Europe and to Uzbekistan likely return to normal? Because certainly I think there's an important question there in terms of tourism, which is a growing sector for the Uzbek economy, but of course also for the business exchanges that we would want to see. So I will address that question to Oybek and to the ambassador. And then the second question for this round that I think we should address is that there has been a few questions in the Q&A around basically debt and the role that both Uzbekistan's credit rating will play, whether or not it will be considered to remain sort of a stable outlook as we see. I believe that S&P rates Uzbekistan right now at BB minus. And also to what extent the debt limit that Louis, you mentioned, and perhaps you can comment on this, that is set at around 50%, I believe, of GDP, will either serve to give confidence to lenders that this is not going to be a runaway train as we've seen in other countries going through crises, or to what extent it might actually prove problematic if Uzbekistan decides it wants to borrow more to sort of stimulate the economy. So perhaps Louis, Eldor, Omid, you might be able to comment on that. But let's start on the question around travel and transport. And Oybek or Ambassador, perhaps Ambassador Rustamov, you'd like to start commenting on that first.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, you're right. Tourism is a key sector of Uzbekistan, and the government pays huge attention to developing this sector. Unfortunately, COVID-19 negatively impacted this sphere. As you probably know, since March 30th, Uzbekistan, all airports have suspended their work, and Uzbekistan terminated all air traffic. I mean, the regular traffic. So, and later, the regular air services of Uzbekistan was terminated until June 30th. But you know, we are. The government is working on this issue. There are two sides actually in this issue. The first is transportation. Of course, we need to relaunch, let's say, the regular air connections. But the second very important issue is to create the conditions for the foreign tourists that they should feel free after, let's say, after COVID-19's period. So there are big measures is going on right now in Uzbekistan, how we should do it, what kind of creative, let's say, the measures should be implemented. So the working is going on. There were also some question regarding the logistics. I saw also. Let me respond briefly on that as well. So the logistics is also, there is no direct, let's say, traditional, let's say, the way of logistics between UK and Uzbekistan. So, let's say, to send our export or goods to UK, for example, we need to. It's quite complicated logistics. It goes through the territory of different countries, and recently, also the COVID-19 negatively impacted to this issue as well. But the government also would like to create some additional measures. And for example, let's say if we are talking about the export of Uzbek goods to some foreign markets, not only to UK. Recently, government extended the list of the goods which would under the compensation mechanism from the government. So, for example, the government would compensate the costs of the local exporters, the partly cost of the local exporters to send the goods for foreign countries, and especially including by the air communication, by the planes as well. And this, from other side, there are also some mechanism to supporting local exporters to taking some, let's say, the certification and all other these documents necessary to reaching the foreign markets, especially the European one with the high level standards and requirements. So again, the process is going on. So we pay big attention to that issues.
Thank you, Ambassador. Oybek, would you like to add anything to that? You may need to unmute yourself. I think we can hear you now. Nope, back to mute.
Yeah, okay, no,
yeah,
sorry about that. Yeah, indeed, the resumption, I want to just touch base on the resumption part. What we have actually, what we actually see more and more, that the companies which are executing the projects as well, despite the lack of usual transportation links, are starting to go back to the sites in Uzbekistan, going through the usual quarantine period. So if they do have to go through the 14-day lock-in period where they self-quarantine or quarantine in the special facilities. I think it's more special facilities. But we see a lot of companies actually starting to go back, and there's probably a lot of business on the line. And I want to say, yes, we do observe that situation. The regular communication is not likely to be back to normal in the nearest period, which was actually advised by the chief medical virologist in Uzbekistan yesterday on TV, on national TV. But there are ways. So the companies which are seeking to go back and to restart projects and are able to, Uzbekistan is much lower risk actually than many countries in Europe or around the world. So we see, for example, some Japanese companies, some European companies which are executing major projects. They are going back to site, sending the engineers through the quarantine and back to work. So this is in terms of travel.
Thank you, Oybek. Omid, I know you want to also comment on this.
In terms of transport and logistics, maybe it's on a broader scale. For example, you might know that the Parliament, the Senate, has also voted for joining the Eurasian Economic Union as an observer. So now, whatever happens, we can send the representatives and observe the processes and decision-making process itself. Our center also conducted some analysis on looking how it might hypothetically joining the Eurasian Economic Union affect the transportation cost. And in this sense, it might also decrease, and the trade between Europe and Uzbekistan might also be accelerated due to the fact. I can explain in a simple example. For example, the cargo of 1 ton going from Gizak to Moscow costs around $90 now. Let's say $3 in Uzbekistan, $60 in Kazakhstan, and $25 in Russia. It will cost hypothetically joining around $50 in terms of transportation cost possible, but this is this comparative analysis. This is what I would like.
Thank you, Omid. That's a useful kind of specific example to look at. On the question around debt, Louis, Oybek, Omid, I don't know if you'd like to comment, but I mean, basically, it's very clear that more support from the IFIs are needed. How can basically those economic operators who are depending to a large extent on these loans being dispersed remain confident that Uzbekistan will continue to have the liquidity it needs to keep the economy stimulated? Let's start with you, Omid, and then we'll turn to Louis and Oybek if you'd like to add as well. Omid, let me unmute you. One moment. Can you unmute yourself?
Yes.
Great.
Can you hear
Thank
me
you.
well now?
Yes.
Okay. So if we talk about ratings, for Fitch, it was announced, I think, reaffirmed in April, so it is BB minus, you mentioned. For the Moody's, it was also B minus with stable outlook, and for the Standard & Poor's, it's also a B minus with stable outlook. In terms of this confidence, if you look at the tax revenue part, the part of the economy which you consider as like a shadow economy is decreasing due to the better and more efficient implementation of tax administration, especially using digital software and technologies. And in this sense, it is stable, and there is a confidence, as Oybek also mentioned, given the gold reserves and other factors, that it will be stable.
Thank you, Omid. Louis, would you like to chime in?
Only to say that I think that the government has been very conscious of the challenges that are associated with increasing foreign debt. I mean, if you look at the way in which the Capital Market Agency has been actively trying to develop the local capital market, then clearly a number of the key players in the government, their preference is indeed to get domestic savings released and invested locally. It's not to go out and borrow money abroad. And to that extent, I guess the key issue is going to be whether or not people have the confidence to invest savings, whether or not they can continue with the development of the local capital market. I guess a related issue would also be privatization. The government has, a year ago, last April, published a decree where it listed a number of assets companies across sectors that were to be privatized. That, of course, is another way of attracting investment. So I think that there'll be a relationship between the ability to pursue reforms of the local capital market to implement the privatization program and the need to go out and borrow money.
Thank you, Louis. Eldor, Oybek, would you like to add anything to that?
Okay, if just short, indeed. So Fitch has rated only, confirmed the rating only in the middle of April, which is fairly recent. In terms of debt, you have to look at all the projections by the IFIs. They do rate Uzbekistan as very stable. And the last IMF report, which is out recently, does say that the debt distress is low. It's for Uzbekistan. This is a major factor. It has been lowered, in fact, from last year, even further. And currently, the GDP stands at the debt to GDP ratio is about 30%. Uzbekistan is indeed able, projecting that it can go up to 50%. And even there, we've spoken with EBRD about a week ago, and even in that sense, EBRD says that's easy. That's easily a safe area where Uzbekistan can still do. And again, the Ministry of Finance says this is the cap. We're not going to go there.
Thank you, Oybek. Eldor, maybe I'll get your opinion on this other question. Just a reminder to everyone, if you have not completed the poll, please do, because we will look at the responses after this next set of questions. But an important and interesting question was raised around that touches both on the privatization issue and also on the foreign investment issue, which is to what extent COVID-19 and the experience of the crisis will change investment priorities for the government, but also for the private sector in the country. One of the audience members asked whether or not there had been any sort of realization that more investment needed to be made in healthcare. But I think similar questions can be asked whether, for example, changes in priorities around energy investment may take place given the impact on global oil prices, or whether food production, as another audience member suggested in the Q&A, might be an area of priority given disruptions to global food supply chains and vulnerabilities that countries may be seeing now. So I thought perhaps Eldor, Louis, Oybek, if you might want to comment on whether or not the crisis is going to basically spur more attention and investment in other areas. The last thing I'll mention is someone in the audience also pointed out that, you know, there's a burgeoning startup scene in Uzbekistan. And in fact, many of these companies with their digital solutions proved very useful during the crisis, for example, in food delivery or e-commerce. So has this been an experience that's going to make people realize that in the government and in the business community that perhaps it might accelerate some of these transformations? It would be good to get everyone's comments. Eldor, if you'd like to start.
Thank you. So I was actually going to touch on this privatization. One important point to make that the government is dealing with privatization quite seriously, and this started even prior to the COVID situation. And what we observe that in various sectors, government is carrying out so-called unbundling. So, for example, in energy sector, in transport sectors, they have unbundled energy producers from distribution, from network. In transport sector, they have unbundled airport operators from the national carrier. And just this few days ago, we saw in the news that President also instructed to review the operation of the national railway company. And I think the aim is also to a certain extent, unbundle its operations to separate core and supporting functions. And the general background here, I think, and the commitment of the government is to delegate to the extent possible areas of economy, services, industries to private sector where there is no, where the private sector is more efficient and no need of state participation. And to the earlier question relating to banking sector, we also a few days ago there was a government resolution paving the way for privatization of major commercial banks. And the aim is to reduce the state role in banking sector as well. So I think in that context, the COVID situation will undoubtedly probably encourage to speed up the privatization process. And we know that the SAMA, State Asset Management Agency, and other Ministry of Finance, which is responsible for privatization of banking sector, are working very intensively in this direction. But the government is cautious. On the other hand, they don't want to privatize just for the sake of privatize. The idea is to privatize efficiently, so that as a result of privatization, new technology will come to the sector, efficiency will improve, and the economy will become more competitive. I think these are some of important criteria on which decision for privatization would be based on. But for sure, privatization is very high on the government's agenda.
Thank you, Eldor. Louis, would you like to add anything to that about priorities that you think in foreign investors might see in the market given sort of the lessons of the crisis?
I mean, in terms of the market itself determining priorities, I mean, I think the focus of private equity funds and private capital in Uzbekistan has been, so far in improving agricultural production, in improving logistics, in online retail. We have a client that is been deploying money across those sectors, and yes, I think the appetite is growing. I think that, if I look at the work we've been doing over the last 2 or 3 weeks, I think that there will be considerable investment now put into the value chain from soil through to market, because clearly it's the value chain that needs to be improved. It's not the quality of the soil or the number of days of sun. It's the packaging, it's the irrigation, it's the transportation, it's the distribution. The same goes for online retail. We see a considerable interest now in actually building modern distribution depots that can service that. And our clients are telling us that whereas 2 months ago it was the teenagers in the family households who were using online shopping opportunities, now it's the heads of household, and they're buying the family's groceries. They're not buying cola and chips. So clearly, if you look at what's happening on the ground, yes, something is happening that investors can get excited about. And yes, there are opportunities, as you say.
Thank you, Louis. So I'm going to share the results of the poll, which has now had over 120 responses in it. And Oybek and Omid, perhaps you can be the first to react to the poll, but hopefully you can all see the poll results now. Is that correct? Can someone confirm that for me? Yeah? Okay, great. So the first question was, what do you consider to be the most significant area of concern for the Uzbek economy following the COVID-19 outbreak? And we see that employment is really tied with foreign investment as the primary area of concern. And, I wonder to what extent that reflects the concerns of those who are in Tashkent, in the economy, and those of us that are looking at the economy from the outside. But it will be interesting, Omid, for example, to get your perspective on whether this corresponds to your center's assessment of the main areas of concern. Second was an important question, also came up in the Q&A, really about the speed of the recovery. So we've looked at the projections from the IFIs that Oybek very helpfully showed, which suggests a real V-shaped recovery, basically that we will return to pre-coronavirus levels of output really starting next year. And it seems that most of the participants in this webinar agree with that. They see that the recovery will happen in 1 to 2 years, which looks reasonably positive. And as a final question, we asked how attractive do you believe Uzbekistan compared with other frontier and emerging markets? And here we have a very strong showing of optimism, with the somewhat more attractive being the most popular response. But if you look at more attractive generally, it's around 78% of responses. So that's a really quite positive assessment that Uzbekistan is moving in the right direction. And Ambassador Rustamov has had to leave the call to take another important call, but it goes back to what he said at the very beginning in his welcoming comments about the sort of quick steps the government took. So Omid, Oybek, does this correspond? Do these results seem in line with what your expectations were, or is there anything surprising that you see here?
Okay, thank you very much. If I may respond first about the employment being the top concern, that is a line of thinking which we were also following. We analyze it on a, I can say, weekly basis from all regions and different parts of Uzbekistan. By now, by our estimates, we have around 143,000 people who were usually working as migrants, maybe somewhere else, and coming back to Uzbekistan, and they were not able to travel, so they stay in Uzbekistan. Also, there is a number of people who lost their job or temporarily not able to work because of the COVID. The number is around 340,000 people. And besides this, we also have people who need to support, like the social care. They're a vulnerable population, we call them. And so what is done, and the recent the meeting, so yesterday, in the leadership announced that out of 450 billion soons, which were allocated for the investment program, 150 billion will be allocated to creating a permanent 80,000 jobs in the rural areas. So this will be kind of a readjustment in this area, because the number one thing is, of course, we need to take care of the people, because first, of course, lives, and second, we need to provide employment, people need to feed their families. So there will be a readjustment in the investment program. Also, from anti-crisis fund, some funds will be allocated to the acceleration of, as was mentioned, in infrastructure projects or the construction projects, which is also labor intensive.
Thank you, Omid. Let me just say briefly for the participants who are not, unfortunately, if you are not using the Zoom desktop application, you can't see the poll results. But what we will do is we will distribute these after the meeting is complete tomorrow, so that you can see the results. Oybek, would you like to comment briefly on these results?
Yes. So indeed, so employment is clearly, I think it's quite a global phenomenon. We will, this will suffer everywhere. I don't want, one of the things that I want to draw attention is, with this webinar, we don't want to draw a rosy picture. We want to give a realistic projections of how the country will deal with the economically with the situation. So when you talk about economic recovery, and just for a second, I want to focus on that. There are two things. One thing is to have the actually the growth go back to the level which it was pre-COVID, and to have the economy to reach the levels where it would have been if this has not been the case. So if the pandemic would not have happened, I think that indeed, based on the projections and all the projections that we have seen so far, I've shown only the IFIs, but we have a lot of projections also from the rating agencies. We have the big corporate projections, starting with Gazprom and finishing with large American banks. Most of the projections are in line that the growth would resume and even surpass what it would have been probably this year without the COVID next year. So meaning 2021 is indeed the year for Uzbekistan to make a jump start of the economy and get somewhere. But when you talk about getting to the pre-COVID levels where we would have been if the growth has not been impacted, that would probably take longer indeed. I saw an article yesterday in an Economist showing that most Western economies actually would go back only within more than 2 years, at least, to the levels of pre-COVID economic situation. Well, the markets, the way they have been growing so far, show us a different picture, but they're probably more optimistic than or more emotional. But when you talk about attractiveness of the country, Uzbekistan is indeed more attractive than than many of the emerging markets or frontier markets right now, simply because look, it's a country which is in top 10 in terms of gold production in the world. I think we are 9th. It's in the top 15, and I think we are 15th actually in terms of the gold reserves in the world. When you talk about gas, the country is selling a huge amount of gas, so we are lucky. Or in terms of when you talk about gold, particularly as a counterweight to any crisis, Uzbekistan is in excellent position. Uzbekistan has started borrowing very late. So in terms of GDP, debt to GDP has grown substantially over the last year, but it has not grown so much over the last 10 years. So overall, we are not more attractive, probably because we are so great, but because it's simply historically happened this way. Of course, the economic response is more important. So the government has also shown an excellent economic response to the crisis, but by being the situation of more attractive, it's probably not so much really the current government's political result of current government's political and economic response, but rather an overall economic situation of Uzbekistan as it stands in the historic period that is we are living right now.
I think that's an excellent point, Oybek, because it also underlines that there's a lot more capacity to be developed in terms of resilience. So, you're basically describing that the country is fortunate to have certain fundamentals of population size, geography, and the kinds of natural resources that are available that help in moments like these. And if on top of that, the government is able to develop, and the private sector, some of the institutional capacities, new legislation, new ways of cooperation to basically respond better to crises, then we can imagine an even more kind of robust sort of economic outlook moving forward. We have around 7 minutes left, and I'm keen to end on time because, of course, we all have plenty on our agendas, even under different stages of lockdown. I'd like to offer Louis and Eldor an opportunity to make some final comments based on what your takeaways are on from this conversation in just 1 or 2 minutes, and then I'll turn back to Oybek and Omid, and then I'll have a few administrative points for the audience about how you will receive the presentations and other sort of follow-up opportunities from the webinar. So, Louis, I'll turn to you first for some final comments, and thank you for the helping get this organized from the standpoint of the British Uzbek Society.
Thank you. I think the only thing to add is something that the ambassador and Umid touched on, and that is the social capital that the Uzbek government has available to it. I think if you compare the challenges that different countries and governments have faced globally, then clearly countries where there is a strong relationship between local communities, regional communities, there is a strong sense of mutual respect, of complying with rules, of common purpose, that they have fared much better than countries where, unfortunately, that is lacking. In Europe, it's Germany, and then clearly in Central Asia, it's Uzbekistan. So I think that for me would be the thing that is of real note. We're not just talking about fiscal policy and government policy. We're talking about a country where there is a genuine synergy between banks, companies, government, and people, and hopefully this experience will encourage the government to develop and use the resources it has, because clearly it probably underestimated the extent it could rely on that social capital, and hopefully it will become a much larger part of the equation going forward.
Thank you, Louis. Eldor, your final thoughts.
Well, I think the COVID has been a test for the economy. So this virus has been testing not only people's health but also economic health. And my takeaway that once we pass over this testing times, the economy will become more resilient. The immune system of the economy will improve, and as Louis noted, I think it will create new opportunities, new businesses, and I think government and private sector learning on this experience to improve the efficiency. I think remote working sometimes is maybe more advantageous than standard way of working, and I think it's creating new opportunities. So in medium term, I think things will get back to normal and even better. Thank you.
Excellent. Oybek, let's turn to you and then to Omid. And thank you also for all of your support in organizing this webinar today.
Thank you, Isfandiar. So just maybe the concluding note would be that indeed it is 3 years, it's been 3.5 years since the changes have started in Uzbekistan. And frankly speaking, the biggest challenge to any government, the real capacity is really shown when the challenge comes along. And COVID, followed by, we had a disaster in Sirdarya, and also we had a difficult situation in Bukhara with the storm. This government has really, this crisis has really shown that, in my view, the capacity, and I try to be independent here, sitting here in Brussels, as much as possible, but the capacity of the government to handle a crisis is critical in terms of working with the government from investment point of view, from the any kind of long-term cooperation kind of view. And this crisis has indeed shown that the changes in Uzbekistan that are happening are indeed not just the words of some officials, but actually something that indeed is there to last and are continuing through the difficult situation. There has been a meeting with the president that the president chaired just last night, saying that the investment projects for the next year should be refocused for social impact. And this was, I think, this was also a very critical point of view, and the ambassador tried to made in the beginning, saying that it's critical. Uzbekistan is focusing on the social impact, on mitigating the social impact first and foremost, and I think this is a very good sign, long term, politically and also economically, frankly speaking. Thank you.
Thank you, Oybek. Omid, the final comments from you in Tashkent. Thank you for your detailed presentation and the data that you provided. And please, your takeaways from the conversation.
Okay, thank you, Raj, everyone. I would say that the cooperation is key, and I think it's, as Louis mentioned, that people were very, very cooperative. Without that, nothing would be possible. And here, not only between the government and people, but also we're hearing more words like resilience now. More and more countries saying that thinking about self-sufficiency, resilience, looking at domestic demand. But I think it is very important not to turn into deglobalization or to kind of isolation policies. And we need to continue enjoying benefits of interdependence in future. And this will be the key, because the cooperation and interdependence, this is what gives a kind of mutual benefit. As a think tank, we will follow what John Boyd said. We will observe, orient, and help people to make decisions, because we simply translate data into policy. And in this sense, we need your feedback. As I said, we already have instruments for business sentiment index in Uzbekistan. We have this for households, but it could be good to have something on a systematic basis with the foreign business. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you, Omid. I mean, that's something that I certainly would be interested to explore, and I'm sure many people on this call would want to participate in, which is to basically create a panel to measure foreign investor sentiment through a regular survey. That's something that we can discuss. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for the call. I am very pleased and relieved that the technology mostly cooperated with us. When I end this meeting, you will see a page that should, if the technology cooperates, have a link to a very short 4-question post-event survey where you'll have an opportunity to give some feedback about your experience in joining this webinar. We are certainly interested with the British Uzbek Society, with EUROUZ and our other partners in Tashkent to host further events on other topics. We did not manage to answer all of the excellent questions that were asked, but hopefully most of them. And thank you all for your interest in this conversation. And I'm glad that we were able to end on an optimistic note about resilience and really people working together. And certainly on this call and among the participants, we have an excellent network so that we can continue to find the solutions for this interesting new phase in Uzbekistan's development and also for the global economy. So thank you very much for the time. We will distribute the presentations by email tomorrow in case they're of use. And again, please do take a moment or two to fill out that poll. And from London, I sign off with my thanks to the excellent panelists for their presentations. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you very much. Have a good day and stay safe.